I never found out what became of my mother. The truth is, I have never even met her. Not long after I was born, I was taken in by another woman, a woman I believed to be my biological mother until I turned 5. She was not related to me by blood, but her kindness and warmth made her feel like the best mother anyone could ask for. My early childhood with her was filled with nothing but happy memories. When I turned 5, she began to tell me about my real mother. She was homeless, she started gently, and one night she came to my door. I sat there, wide-eyed and hanging on her every word. She must have been a good woman, she continued, her voice soft but steady. But she did not have a home to keep you safe in. It was winter, so cold, and she had nowhere to go. She had lost her job and had no money. That is why she left you with me. At the time, I had so many questions swirling in my head, but my adoptive mother kept her story simple, breaking it down in a way that my young mind could grasp. As I grew older, she shared more of the story, piece by piece. One night, she said, I was sitting right here in the living room with your Uncle Tony. We both heard someone knock at the door. When Tony opened it, there was this young, petite, and very pretty woman standing on the porch. Whenever she described my mother, it filled me with a quiet kind of joy. How young? I asked, curiosity spilling out. Like, was she a teenager or in her 20s? She could have been in her late teens, maybe her 20s or even her 30s, she replied thoughtfully. She was definitely young. Too young to handle everything life was throwing at her on her own. What was her name? I asked, eager to know more. Her name was Jessica Evans, she said. She then filled in the gaps of the story, the details I had been aching to hear for years. The first thing we noticed, she said with a warm smile, was the baby she was holding. That baby was you. She reached out and gently touched my arm, her smile full of love. It was January, the dead of winter, she went on, and she was standing there in just a thin flannel shirt, no jacket. She was shaking from head to toe, holding you tightly. She had wrapped you in her coat to keep you warm. I listened, my heart breaking a little at the thought of my mother out in the freezing cold like that. She looked like she was in a desperate situation, but I still asked if she was okay. She just shook her head. That was when Tony brought her inside and sat her down on the couch. I made her some hot chocolate and wrapped a warm blanket around her. Then we talked for a while, she explained. What did she say? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She told us she was at rock bottom. The place she worked at had been struggling to stay open, and her wages had been cut before the place finally closed for good. After that, she bounced around, staying with family members. But eventually, they got tired of helping her and sent her away. At this point, the lump in my throat was too big to ignore, and I felt my eyes sting with tears. Where is she now? Where has she been all this time? I asked, my voice trembling. She knelt down beside me and pulled me into a tight hug before answering. I wish I knew, she said, her voice full of sorrow. When Tony and I went to the kitchen to get her something, we heard the front door open. By the time we came back, she was gone. She left you here on the couch. She hugged me tighter and kissed my forehead. Jessica only wanted what was best for you, she said. She did not want you to grow up struggling by her side. She wanted you to have a life full of love and stability. Do not hold it against her, sweetheart. She would have been a wonderful mother if things had been different. In that moment, I was not angry with my mother. I could not even bring myself to resent her. All I wanted was to see her face, to wrap my arms around her the way I was hugging my adoptive mom right then. The next morning, my adoptive mother said softly, I woke up and saw a note slipped under the front door. It was from her. She said she was leaving the area for a while, but if we chose to keep you, she would come back to visit or at least check to see if you were still here. She did not say exactly when, but she promised she would return someday. Even though much of what she told me was heartbreaking, that last part lifted my spirits. From that moment on, the thought of seeing my birth mother someday filled me with hope, a kind of hope that stayed with me year after year. From then on, I made it a habit to ask the same question when I got home from school. Did she come? Is she here? The answer was always no. After a while, I became hesitant to ask, afraid of hearing the same response and feeling that familiar disappointment. But I never let go of the hope that one day it would be yes. Even years later, I kept wondering if she had stopped by while I was away. Sometimes I would be out somewhere and think to myself, is she at home right now, waiting for me? Through all those years, I do not recall a single time when my adoptive mother and I had serious tension between us. Even as a teenager, when most kids clash with their parents, we got along just fine. My birthdays were always low-key, though. She never threw big parties or let me invite friends over, even though I had plenty. But she made sure I felt special in her own way. For birthdays, we would do things like catch the latest superhero movie or head to the carnival that always came to town around that time of year. Sometimes Uncle Tony would take me outside for some fun, doing outdoor activities like hiking or fishing. I appreciated those celebrations, but deep down, I always wished I could have spent more time with my friends outside of school. I never understood why she kept me from that. Uncle Tony was a constant presence in my life for as long as I could remember. He lived with us and was always there. He had never been married, and as far as I knew, he had never even gone on a date or had a girlfriend. Tony loved the outdoors. He spent a lot of time in the woods, fishing or camping for days at a time. It was his routine to head out twice a month, usually staying for 2 or 3 nights. Often, he would come back in the middle of the night. As a kid, I would wake up to the sound of the door creaking open and run downstairs to greet him, trying to keep quiet so my adoptive mom would not catch me. "Does Theresa know you're up?" he would whisper with a mischievous grin, knowing how much trouble I could get into if she found out. When I was in middle school, Tony started taking me along on his camping trips. I could not always tag along, especially since he camped year-round, but I joined him every other month or so. During summer, we went more often. I adored Uncle Tony. He was my partner in crime, the one who let me bend the rules my adoptive mom set. Since I could not hang out with friends, spending time with him was my escape. We would sneak out at night, build a fire, and sit under the stars, talking about everything and nothing. I will never forget the night he handed me my first beer when I was 16. He was sitting by the fire, chugging a can of beer, when he reached for the 6-pack and passed it to me. I gave him a confused look, unsure of what to do. He just chuckled. "Come on," he said. "It's all we've got to drink anyway." I hesitated before cracking one open. He smirked and said, "You tell, I'll kick your ass." One morning, I woke up in our tent to find that Tony was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, tossed aside, with his gear scattered around. This was nothing new. He was always up before me, usually heading to the lake to fish. Normally, I would wait an hour or so before joining him. But that day I decided to grab a quick bite and head out right away. When I got to the lake, he was not there. His fishing pole, bait bucket, and chair were all set up by the water, but Tony was nowhere in sight. I scanned the area and eventually spotted him near the hospital that stood a short distance away from the lake. Caught me off guard since we had fished there for years and never paid much attention to that building. Even more surprising, Tony was talking to a young woman. At first, I thought he might be flirting because they were both laughing. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and noticed something else. She was pregnant. I pulled out my binoculars to get a closer look and confirmed it. She definitely had a baby bump. Minutes passed, and Tony was still talking to her. I kept glancing over, curious about what was going on. When he finally returned, I was so focused on fishing that I did not notice him right away. "Well, I see you decided to wake up early today," he said, walking over to his chair. He grabbed his fishing pole and started baiting his hook. "Who was that woman?" I asked, unable to hide the grin on my face. He paused for a moment, then turned to me with a serious look. "Do not get any ideas," he said. "She is just someone I helped out." "When did you meet her?" I pressed. He cast his line into the water before replying. "A couple of months ago," he said. I was out here fishing by myself when I noticed her struggling to pick something up. I grabbed my binoculars to get a better look and saw that she had dropped her purse and some bags. She could not bend down to pick them up because of her pregnancy. He reeled in his line as he spoke, his tone calm but firm. So I ran over and helped her, Uncle Teddy continued, his voice casual but warm. Picked up her things and walked her to her car. She thanked me and then asked where I came from since I wasn't parked in the lot. I told her I've been fishing and camping here for years. From there, we just started talking about one thing and then another. We've been chatting ever since. Every time I see her leave the building, I make my way over to say hi. He paused, his words hanging in the air like the gentle ripple of the lake. I couldn't help but grin. You've been talking to her for months? Uncle Teddy glanced at me briefly, then shifted his focus back to the lake, casting his line again. You know how far along she is? I pressed. When I first met her, she said she was 5 months. But as her due date gets closer, she's been showing up at the maternity ward more often. Baby could come any day now, he replied. Setting my fishing pole down, I asked, where's the father in all this? Shouldn't he be the one supporting her? Uncle Teddy sighed, reeling in his lines slowly. She hasn't said much about him. Honestly, I don't think he's in the picture anymore. So what's the deal? You planning to play stepdad? I teased, breaking into a laugh. He chuckled, shaking his head. Come on now. It's nothing like that. I'm just a stranger keeping her company. That's all. We continued fishing until the afternoon, leaving with a solid catch that would last us the week. By the time night fell, we had a campfire crackling in front of us, its warm glow chasing away the evening chill. As I stared into the flames, lost in thought, my mind wandered back to my mother. Do you think she finally came today? I asked, breaking the silence. Uncle Teddy took a slow drag from his cigarette and exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the night sky. Don't worry, Donald. Janice is probably just waiting until she's got herself together before she comes. She'll be here eventually, promise. His words comforted me, like they always did, but I knew better by now. That feeling of hope was fleeting, here one moment and gone the next. A few hours later, we packed up and headed home. The clock read midnight as we pulled into the driveway, and my mind was racing with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, my mother would be waiting for me. But as we approached, I saw the figure on the porch. A woman, wrapped in a house robe, cigarette glowing in the dark. My heart sank when I realized it wasn't her. It was my adoptive mother. Uncle Teddy noticed the disappointment written all over my face. Without saying a word, he reached over and gave my shoulder a reassuring pat before turning off the engine. You want to start taking the gear down to the basement? He asked. I nodded silently, hopping out of the truck and grabbing our fishing poles, bags, and whatever else I could carry. My adoptive mother greeted me as I walked past her. Have fun? She asked with a playful smile, pinching my cheek gently. Yeah, I said, managing a small smile in return before heading inside. Down in the basement, I set our fishing poles on the rack and placed the bags on the floor. As I turned, my elbow knocked into an old shelf, sending a few books tumbling down. I knelt to pick them up, and that's when one of them caught my eye. The cover was plain, with the words "Beloved Memories" written across the front on a strip of masking tape. Curious, I picked it up. The book was thin, barely more than 10 pages. Beloved Memories? I whispered to myself, opening it carefully. The first page greeted me with 2 large photographs, side by side. One was of a young man, the other a young woman. The woman's photo was in black and white, her expression soft and serene. Beneath the pictures, their ages were written, both 18 at the time the photos were taken. I stared at the faces, trying to piece together who they might be. I turned to the next page and saw smaller pictures, each one showing the same little boy. At first, it didn't register, but as I took in the images, I noticed the boy was alone in nearly all of them. Standard school photos were mixed with candid moments. Playing outside, blowing out a candle on a birthday cake, or holding a marshmallow over a campfire. Even in these happy moments, there was no one else in the frame. One picture stood out. The boy, a bit older now, holding a marshmallow over the campfire. It felt strangely familiar, yet distant, as if I'd seen that look in someone else's eyes before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped back to the first page. I studied the 18-year-old boy's photo again, then returned to the newer images. Slowly, it hit me, the little boy in these pictures was the same as the young man on the first page. I flipped forward again, and this time I saw a newborn baby. The infant was cradled in someone's arms, but the photo didn't show the face of whoever was holding him. Beneath the image was a date, 1987. I frowned. None of this made sense. On the next page, I froze. The photos were different now, filled with people I recognized. Uncle Teddy and my adoptive mother appeared in several shots, their faces lit with joy. They were holding the little boy, playing with him and laughing. In one picture, Uncle Teddy had the boy seated on a four-wheeler, both of them grinning from ear to ear. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. Another photo showed my adoptive mother lying on a bed, laughing, as the boy crawled on top of her with a mischievous grin. I flipped again. This time there was a little girl. Her photos mirrored the boy's. School pictures, baby photos, and playful moments. The girl's images were in black and white, with dates beneath them that ranged from the late 60s to the early 70s. I flipped back to the first page, scanning the faces again. The little girl, just like the boy, was the same as the young woman in the first photo. What really threw me off was the background of the photos. The settings didn't match anything I knew. These weren't taken in our house or anywhere nearby. They looked like they were from a completely different city, maybe even another state. It didn't add up. My adoptive mother always told me she and Uncle Teddy had lived in our house their whole lives, and they'd never mentioned any other children besides me. What was going on? I flipped through the rest of the book, taking in more snapshots of these mysterious lives. The older boy appeared in several photos with Uncle Teddy, around campfires, in the woods, even holding a shotgun. My guess was Uncle Teddy had taken many of the pictures himself. The older girl's photos featured my adoptive mother. In one, the girl posed in a dress, looking serene and poised. In another, my adoptive mother hugged the girl tightly, their smiles radiating warmth. The more I looked, the clearer it became. These two were the young adults from the first page. One detail stood out: the absence of prom photos. There weren't any of the boy or the girl. Then I remembered. My adoptive mother hadn't allowed me to go to prom either. She never explained why. I closed the book, holding it tightly as I headed upstairs. But as I climbed the steps, I heard voices. My adoptive mother and Uncle Teddy were whispering, their tones low and cautious. I couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but a few phrases caught my attention. She still goes to the hospital? How long before the baby? Any day now. When I stepped out of the basement, they both stopped mid-conversation and turned toward me. Uncle Teddy chuckled awkwardly. "Oh, hey," he said. "I came in talking to your mom and forgot to help unload." But his words faltered when he noticed the book in my hands. His smile disappeared, replaced by a blank, almost guarded expression. My adoptive mother's face shifted too. Her mild tension turned to outright alarm. "What?" I asked, looking between them. My adoptive mother forced a smile and walked toward me. "Nothing, sweetie," she said, her tone overly bright. "You two just finish unloading the truck." Before I could react, she snatched the photo book out of my hands and rushed upstairs. Uncle Teddy and I unloaded the rest of the gear in silence. The way he looked at me as I passed sent a shiver down my spine. The next few weeks brought warmer weather, and Uncle Teddy and I went camping more often. But things felt different. The easygoing connection we always shared seemed strained. Uncle Teddy still laughed and joked, but there were more awkward pauses. Sometimes he seemed lost in thought, as if he forgot I was even there. And I couldn't stop thinking about that book, or the way they'd reacted when they saw me with it. Why were they acting so strange? What was it about those photos that they didn't want me to see? There was a subtle, unsettling shift in my adoptive mother's demeanor. Her usual affection, the warmth I had known my entire life, now felt like a performance. Her smile seemed strained, her greetings hollow, like she was trying too hard to uphold the image of the loving mother I'd always seen her as. Uncle Teddy wasn't any better. For weeks, neither of them mentioned the photo book or the strange way they'd reacted when they caught me holding it. But then, out of nowhere, Uncle Teddy brought it up during one of our fishing trips. We were sitting quietly by the lake when he broke the silence. "The photos you saw," he began, staring at the water. "Those were from when your mother and I used to visit family. The kids in those pictures, Bonnie and Blake, were our cousins. This was before we got you," he added, almost as an afterthought. The explanation sounded plausible enough, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something didn't add up. Why had they acted so strange about it in the first place? Why the awkward silences and the weeks-long delay before offering such a simple explanation? I mulled over his words, trying to push down my doubts, but something about the way he said, "before we got you," sent a chill through me. I decided to change the subject, hoping to make sense of something else that had been gnawing at me. "What about my birth mom?" I asked cautiously. For a moment, Uncle Teddy didn't respond. He sighed, barely audible, but the look on his face said more than words ever could. It was as if he were silently begging me to drop it. Still, he managed a response. "Donald, I know Janice wants to see you as much as you want to see her, but we have to give her time." His tone was polite enough, but I caught the edge in his voice. My frustration bubbled to the surface. How much time did she need? She'd left me 18 years ago. What exactly was she waiting for? Uncle Teddy didn't offer any reassurance. Instead, he seemed more focused on the hospital across the lake, as he often was during our fishing trips. Like clockwork, he'd bring out his binoculars every half hour, scanning the hospital entrance. Sure enough, one morning, the pregnant woman appeared. She stepped out of the building, rubbing her round belly. Uncle Teddy's face lit up instantly. He abandoned his fishing pole and bolted across the field toward her, leaving me behind to watch from the shoreline. Curious, I grabbed my binoculars and zoomed in on the scene. Uncle Teddy greeted her with a big hug, and she returned it with equal enthusiasm. One time, I saw him kneel and press his ear to her stomach, listening to her unborn baby. I chuckled to myself. "He's totally trying to hook up with this pregnant chick," I mumbled, shaking my head. Uncle Teddy seemed like a completely different person when he was around her. Their conversations were animated and warm, lasting at least 25 minutes each time. He was open and attentive in a way he hadn't been with me lately. One day, he turned mid-conversation and pointed in my direction. I froze, not sure what to do until I noticed the woman waving at me with a wide smile. Her genuine expression caught me off guard. I forced a smile and waved back awkwardly. The whole dynamic left me puzzled. Uncle Teddy was growing distant from me, yet he was all too eager to connect with this stranger. One night, after another quiet trip to the lake, we pulled into the driveway. I wasn't expecting much, just the usual routine of unloading our gear. But before the truck even came to a full stop, my adoptive mother came rushing out of the house. She practically sprinted to my side of the truck, yanking the door open before I could unbuckle my seatbelt. She came! She came!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. Her face was lit with an excitement I hadn't seen in weeks. Genuine, unrestrained joy. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew exactly who she meant. Janice, my birth mother. The words sank in slowly, almost too good to be true. I stood there, stunned, barely able to breathe. After all this time, after years of waiting and wondering, it was finally happening. What? I stammered, my voice shaking with disbelief. "Is she in the house?" My adoptive mother didn't answer right away, too caught up in her excitement. She gripped my arm and led me to the front door, practically bouncing with joy. Unfortunately, when we entered the house, there was no one there. My mother wasn't waiting like I had hoped, but apparently she had been earlier. She came by a few hours ago, looking for you? My adoptive mother explained, her eyes glowing. Around 6 or 7 o'clock. She's still such a beautiful woman, barely aged a day. My adoptive mother's voice held reverence. She went on to tell me how she'd invited my mother in when she arrived. They'd spent time together, talking about where she had been and what she had been doing all these years. My adoptive mother had even come up with the idea to surprise me, thinking it would be the perfect reunion. They had planned to wait for me to get back so we could all meet, but there was a hitch. My birth mother was staying at a homeless shelter, and they had a curfew. If she wasn't back in time, she would lose her place for the night. While my heart was racing with joy, a part of my mind couldn't help but linger on the details. Almost 20 years, and my mother was still homeless? I had a million questions swirling in my head, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to spoil this moment. I was finally going to meet her, the woman I had spent years wondering about. I told you she'd come around eventually, Uncle Teddy chimed in with a smirk, the edges of his mouth twitching into a half-smile. Both he and my adoptive mother suggested I visit the shelter the next day to meet my mother. We talked late into the night about how everything would unfold. By the time I went to bed, I was so excited that sleep eluded me completely. The next morning, I woke up early, eager for the day ahead. To my surprise, both Uncle Teddy and my adoptive mother were already up and moving. Uncle Teddy was carrying boxes from the basement to his truck, while my adoptive mother was rummaging through the closet in her bedroom, seemingly looking for something. At first, I thought they were coming with me, but when I told them I was ready, I was caught off guard by their response. Teddy and I have some errands to run, my adoptive mother explained. We're going to start by pawning some of this old stuff we don't need. We'll meet you there. You won't be long, will you? She handed me some bus fare and suggested I leave a little earlier than them since they still had things to load into the truck. I'd prefer if we all went together, but I didn't protest. The thought of seeing my birth mother was all-consuming. I caught the bus that took me toward the street I'd saved in my phone. When I arrived at the shelter, I immediately spotted the small crowd outside, signaling this was the place. I rushed across the street, bursting through the double doors, my heart pounding. The hallway inside was brightly lit, and I made my way toward the front desk, where an older woman sat behind a computer. I'm here to see a woman named Janice Edwards, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She scanned her computer, typing in my mother's name, then looked up at me with a neutral expression. I'm sorry, there's no one here by that name. Confused, I pressed, Are you sure? Could you check again? She sighed and performed another search, but the result was the same. Sorry, I really can't find anyone by that name. I stood there for a moment, the news settling slowly in my mind. Something wasn't right. I pressed the receptionist to check again, repeatedly, but each time the answer was the same. There was no Janice Edwards in their system. Confusion consumed me. Did I have the wrong shelter? Was there a mistake? I stepped outside, pulling out my phone and dialing my adoptive mother. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. Frustrated, I called Uncle Teddy. Still no response. Damn it! I yelled, slamming my fist into my palm. A homeless man lying on the sidewalk turned his head to look at me. Standing there, helpless and angry, I tried their numbers again and again, but neither of them picked up. After about 20 minutes of this, I decided to head to the hospital by the lake. Maybe they were there or perhaps at the camping spot nearby. When the bus pulled up near the hospital, I jumped off and started walking toward the lake. As I neared the water, I noticed something floating near the edge. At first, I couldn't make it out, but there was a red hue spreading through the water around it. I called my adoptive mother one more time as I quickened my pace, but it went to voicemail again. Cursing under my breath, I shoved the phone into my pocket and stepped closer to the shore. That's when I realized the object in the water wasn't just debris. It was a person. My heart leaped into my throat as I ran to the edge. A petite body floated sideways in the lake. Long hair fanned out across the water's surface. As I approached, the figure rolled slightly, revealing a horrifying sight. Her stomach was mutilated, torn open with jagged wounds. Blood and organs floated in the water around her. My breath caught in my chest when I noticed what looked like an umbilical cord tangled in the murky red cloud. She had been pregnant. Someone had taken her baby. I staggered back, gasping, my hands trembling. Then, I saw her face, and everything came crashing down. It was her. The pregnant woman Uncle Teddy had been talking to for months. I stumbled back and screamed, fumbling for my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911, shouting into the phone as I sprinted back toward the hospital. When I burst into the building, everyone in the waiting room turned toward me. I yelled to the dispatcher, giving them every detail I could. Nurses rushed over as I explained the grisly scene. "Lisa!" one of them cried. The name passed through the group like a wave, their faces contorted in grief. Some of them began to sob, and the weight of it all hit me even harder. The police arrived quickly, and I led them to the body. I couldn't bring myself to look again, so I ran back inside, shaking and numb. The officers spoke to the hospital staff briefly before taking me to the station for questioning. They asked me about my parents. I explained that my guardians were my adoptive mother and Uncle Teddy, but that I hadn't been able to reach them all day. One of the detectives tried calling them, but like me, he got no answer. After several failed attempts, they asked for my address. Minutes later, the detective got a call. His face darkened as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to me. "Your house. It's on fire." I broke down, my body trembling with sobs. "What the hell is going on today?" The detective put a hand on my shoulder to console me, but he continued asking questions. "What brought you to the hospital?" Through tears, I explained everything. The homeless shelter, how I had been searching for my birth mother, how no one could find her name in the system, and how I had gone to the lake to find my adoptive mother and Uncle Teddy. "What's your biological mother's name?" he asked. "Janice Edwards," I replied, choking on the words. The detective stood up without a word and left the room. For the next hour, I sat alone, drowning in my thoughts. Every 20 minutes or so, the detective peeked in to check on me. His expression grew darker each time. When he finally returned, his face was heavy with disappointment. I knew more bad news was coming. "We called the shelter," he began, his voice measured but tense. "They confirmed there's no record of a Janice Edwards staying there. We searched through local and national databases." He paused, as if bracing himself. "And it's only rational to conclude that a woman named Janice Edwards doesn't exist. At least, not in this township." My heart stopped. Everything I thought I knew shattered.